The entire episode kicked off when I ventured into an unfamiliar place. Having dropped off one of our more bothersome clients at the airport, enduring a morning filled with his complaints, I felt no rush to return to the office. Given the dreary Tuesday and the prospect of an afternoon reviewing contracts, I decided to stop at a drab-looking bar restaurant about a mile from the airport. The plan was to enjoy a leisurely lunch and a beer or two before heading back to work in the salt mines. Seated in a booth, savoring my beer and contemplating the challenge of finding a decent burger in this world, my attention was captured by a couple entering the restaurant. Observing as they settled into a booth across the room, sitting side by side, I couldn't help but notice the woman, a shapely blonde in a short skirt showcasing her attractive legs, paired with a tight pink short-sleeve top. Her companion seemed like a thug wannabe, struggling to pull off the look in skinny jeans and a black leather jacket. My heightened interest in this seemingly happy couple becomes clear when I reveal that the woman was Shelley, my sister-in-law, and the guy with her was undoubtedly not her husband, my brother Dave. Worse still, it was evident they were more than casual acquaintances. They placed their drink orders with the waitress and immediately engaged in unrestrained displays of affection, necking in the booth. Shocked, I watched as the guy slid his hand up her thigh under the short skirt. Shelley broke their kiss, letting her head fall back against the booth, sighing. The question wasn't whether I would address this situation. That was a given. The real dilemma was whether I could restrain myself from confronting them violently right there in the restaurant. I had never been fond of Shelley, disliking her from the time my brother started dating her. My pessimism persisted when he fell head over heels in love with her and announced their marriage just 4 months into the relationship. Dave, at 23, seemed unaware of what he was getting into. However, there was simply no way to convey to him that Shelley was everything to him. To me, she was a pretty, cheerful, somewhat shallow and selfish girl, not nearly as smart or interesting as Dave himself. They both seemed to adore the same person, Shelley. He would do anything for her, and that's exactly what she liked. To my pleasant surprise, the first 3 years of their marriage appeared to be very happy. However, the scene unfolding 30 feet from me suggested that the happy days were over. The guy she was with now had his hand on Shelley's waist, kissing her neck as he worked her over. With her eyes closed, she didn't see me approach and was startled when I sat down across the table from them, casually greeting Shelley. The comical moment unfolded as her eyes popped open, and her boyfriend pulled his hands off her, turning to look at me. Her face went from momentarily startled to stunned and then truly shocked. Her jaw dropped, and she froze, staring blankly at me. His face held the same startled look, momentarily, before turning annoyed. Before he could speak, I continued in a cordial manner, inquiring about how she'd been and asking about Dave. Turning to him and extending my hand, I introduced myself as Will, Shelley's brother-in-law, emphasizing the connection to her husband, Dave. His eyes widened, and he sat frozen. Ignoring my hand, Shelley began to recover herself, babbling about Robbie being an old friend. With a friendly smile, I casually remarked on the relationship situation they were caught in, leaving Shelley gasping and hoping I hadn't witnessed their activities. Robbie abruptly stood up and muttered that he had to leave. Without even a glance back at Shelley, he walked swiftly out of the restaurant. Later, I casually remarked to Shelley that Robbie seemed like a nice guy and questioned why he left so suddenly. Internally, I seethed with rage at the treatment my brother Dave was receiving from this woman. Expressing my frustration, I kept my voice down, but made it clear that Dave adored Shelley, doing everything for her. However, it wasn't enough for her, as she engaged in illicit activities with a questionable individual sporting greasy hair and a poorly executed Matt Dillon mustache. Shelley looked terrified, her face turning pale. In response to my accusations, she stammered, trying to explain, but her voice trailed off without a conclusion. After observing her for a minute, I unleashed my anger, expressing disappointment at her actions. I questioned how long this had been going on and how many others she was involved with. Shelley pleaded, grabbing my hand desperately, and begged me not to tell Dave. Despite her pleas, I considered informing my brother about his wife's infidelity. I questioned whether he deserved to know the truth about the person he was married to. Shelley was either incredibly naive or too stunned to think clearly. I pulled my hand free, contemplating whether I should reveal the painful truth to Dave. Her eyes were wild, and she seemed to be thinking frantically. I sat back with a smile, curious about what she would offer to keep me silent. Shelley, after some contemplation, changed her expression. She pleaded with me not to tell Dave, promising to reveal the entire story. According to her, she claimed that another woman, someone I was involved with, was cheating on me. I laughed at the seemingly far-fetched revelation. Shelley looked at me steadily, insisting that she wasn't kidding. According to her, the other woman had been seeing a guy from the health club for at least a couple of weeks. This certainty unsettled me, even though I knew it to be impossible. We had been together for 7 happy years of marriage and a decade overall. She was devoted, sensible, kind, thoughtful, and the most honest person I knew. She loved me, and I was sure of it, just as sure as I was of my own love for her. Shelley leaned forward, sensing my confusion. She claimed to be telling the truth, mentioning that the other woman had confided in her about the affair the previous week. I scrutinized her face, trying to gather my thoughts. Despite her initial terror, Shelley appeared calm and in control, as if she were sharing a genuine revelation rather than spinning a wild and desperate tale. While I couldn't immediately dismiss what she was saying, it was challenging to believe given our history and her recent behavior. Seated at the dinner table, my gaze returned to Shelley, who seemed to be anticipating my next move. Although I didn't reveal it to her, concealing her infidelity from Dave was not an option. I needed to uncover the truth about him. I spoke slowly, suggesting that perhaps we could reach an agreement. After some contemplation, I expressed my unwillingness to let Anne deceive me. I proposed that if Shelley could help me gather information about Anne's actions, I wouldn't disclose what I had witnessed that afternoon to Dave. However, I laid down a condition. She had to swear not to see Robbie or any other man besides Dave. Relief washed over her face as she swore to comply. She asked, "Will you have my word on it?" I remained skeptical about the value of her word. Responding to her question, I inquired about what she would be willing to do to fulfill her part of the agreement. Expressing my desire to gather information about Anne's affair, I suggested a plan to Shelley. I proposed providing her with a tape recorder to conceal in her apartment. The idea was for her to invite Anne over, offer some wine, and engage in casual conversation, encouraging Anne to reveal details about her affair. I specified that I wanted to know the identity of the man, when and how the affair started, how often she had been with him, and the reasons behind her actions. As I spoke to Shelley, I realized that I was starting to believe her unusual story about Anne's infidelity, which infuriated me. Shelley nodded in agreement, stating that she could carry out the plan. She suggested softening Anne up by sharing the details of my own affair, making it feel like a genuine relationship conversation. Sarcastically, I questioned if Robbie was the only one who had been involved with her, or if there were others. She quickly denied any others, but I remained unconvinced. 20 minutes later, I was driving back to the office, contemplating somber thoughts about the potential end of Dave's marriage, and the looming possibility of the end of mine. My first instinct might have been to call Dave and inform him about what I had witnessed Shelley doing, but I recognized that it wasn't an option. I had always been the steady older brother, while Dave was the charming and outgoing one with a history of short-lived relationships due to his talkative nature. When Dave met Shelley, everything changed. Despite being a confident and charming individual, he became a lovesick schoolboy within a month or two. Shelley had completely captivated him, and he was determined to marry her. Dave idolized Shelley, considering her incapable of doing any wrong. Knowing Dave's unwavering devotion to Shelley, I refrained from speaking to him until I had concrete evidence. I realized that he wouldn't believe she was cheating unless he heard it directly from her. Despite my hopes that Shelley might be lying or mistaken about Anne's faithfulness to me, the likelihood diminished. The possibility that Shelley could have lied to me out of desperation crossed my mind, but I also considered the consequences of discovering it was all a fabrication. When I arrived at my office, I took out a pad and made notes on the steps I would have to take if the worst turned out to be true. This included considerations about credit cards, selling the house, transferring car titles, and more. I hoped that in a few days, I would be able to discard that sheet of paper. When I arrived home for dinner, cheerfully humming in the kitchen as she set the table, She greeted me with a big hug and a kiss, appearing as the loving wife I'd usually be happy to see at the end of the day. Despite my suspicions, cultivated over the past 7 years, I knew I had to play the innocent husband for a few more days. Underneath the surface, I felt a mix of fury and hurt, unsure of how to process my emotions. We chatted amicably during dinner, but when she mentioned her workout at the health club during dessert, I couldn't resist a bit of probing. I casually remarked to Shelley, commenting on her recent dedication to workouts. I asked if the club was now offering free ice cream. She laughed, though I noticed a slight flush on her face. She explained that she had been enjoying the positive feeling of a good, sweaty workout and coming home to her loving husband. She also mentioned that a few weeks ago, the black slacks I liked were starting to feel tight, but now they fit perfectly. She beamed affectionately, and despite my concerns about her fidelity, I couldn't help but appreciate her beauty and my love for her. If she were truly cheating on me, I couldn't help but feel conflicted and unsure of how to navigate the situation. Despite what the court calendar officially stated, my marriage ended exactly 1 week later, on another Tuesday. Shelley and I had orchestrated everything. I provided her with a small tape recorder to hide in her living room, and she arranged for Anne to drop by for lunch on a Tuesday afternoon when Anne had a day off from work. Shelley, who didn't have a job, kept me on edge throughout that afternoon in my office, pretending to work, contemplating what the women were discussing and its potential impact on my life at 430. When Shelley called and informed me that they were done and Anne had left, my heart sank. Desperately hoping for a different outcome, I asked if Anne had talked to her about it. Shelley, sounding a little drunk, giggled affirmatively. She shared that she had told Anne about Robbie, and Anne, in turn, disclosed details about Marion, emphasizing that he was a really big fella. Feeling the tension, I realized I was squeezing the phone so tightly that my fingers ached. I agreed to drop by in 20 minutes. When I reached Shelley's place, she handed me the tape recorder at the door. Reminding me of the promise I made not to disclose anything, I assured her that he wouldn't hear a word from me. I emphasized the importance of ensuring that Anne never found out about the recording, as she might become furious and potentially tell Dave. Nodding in acknowledgement, I turned and left. That evening was one of the most painful of my life. Knowing I couldn't listen to the tape until Anne was asleep, I continued pretending to be the loving husband while she was still a little tipsy. She shared that she had spent the afternoon with Shelley and had consumed a lot of wine. Additionally, she was amorous. After clearing the dinner dishes, she pulled me towards the bedroom, asking if I had a little something for her tonight. In a flirtatious tone, I questioned whether I could or even wanted to go through with it. The thought crossed my mind that it might be the last time I would ever have closeness with Anne. Still hoping, against all reason, that she might not have been unfaithful, I followed her into the bedroom, and we had lovemaking. For me, it wasn't making love. My torn heart and worried mind overshadowed any pleasure. We rested for a while in each other's arms, then repeated the act a few minutes later. Anne was fast asleep, snoring gently on her side next to me. I retreated to the guest room, closed the door behind me, and listened to the tape. The first few minutes of conversation between Shelley and Anne were breezy and casual, with Shelley keeping the wine flowing. After a while, she confessed to Anne that she had something to share. She proceeded to share the details of her affair with the a-hole Robbie. It became evident that Anne was already aware of the affair, and Shelley was merely providing her with the juicy specifics to soften her up. Shelley executed her role admirably, even confessing with a laugh that Robbie was just the latest, not the best. There had been a guy named Ellis, but unfortunately, he had moved out of town. Anne giggled and pretended to be shocked, though she appeared to be enjoying the story. The explicit details of the sleazy narrative had little effect on me. I already knew what Shelley was, and the added specifics would only make it easier to convince Dave that she had indeed cheated on him. Anxiously awaiting the inevitable, I resisted the urge to fast-forward the tape. Eventually, Shelley redirected the conversation towards Andy, expressing curiosity about my story. She giggled, mentioning that all I had shared so far was meeting him at the health club and his well-endowed nature. My body tensed as I listened to Anne's voice on the recording, laughing and describing Andy as amazing, the largest she had ever encountered. She went on to share more details, expressing initial doubts about it fitting inside her, leading to laughter from both women. Overwhelmed by the revelations, I stopped the tape and leaned back in my chair, absorbing the painful truth. My marriage was now officially over. Did I even want to hear the rest? I considered letting my lawyer listen to it. After some thought, I switched the machine back on. It was time to face the entire story, confront the anger and pain, and begin the process of figuring out what the rest of my life would look like. Shelley inquired about the beginning of the affair, asking how it started. Anne responded, explaining that she never meant to cheat on me and felt terrible about it. She mentioned our happiness together and expressed her disbelief in engaging in infidelity. She attributed it to having a bad case of BDF, which she found amusing. Laughing, Anne heard Shelley ask about BDF, and she promised to explain after having more wine. Anne continued, sharing that she had been going to the health club for a couple of years to avoid getting saggy and to maintain my interest. A few months ago, she started noticing a new trainer named Marion, describing him as hot with broad shoulders and amazing muscles. She mentioned his flirtatious behavior with women and recalled witnessing him talking quietly with Patty McAllister, a former colleague. Anne watched Patty enter Marion's office, and later, in the locker room, Patty appeared well-drilled, exhibiting a dreamy-eyed look and a vague smile. I greeted Patty and noticed her happy demeanor. She shared that she had a bad case of BTF, explaining it as big tool fever. She giggled, ensuring no one could hear her, and recounted her experiences with Marion, emphasizing his sensational qualities as a lovemaking partner and the impressive size of his tool. Patty described how Marion had flirted with her, eventually convincing her to go into his office, leading to an ongoing carnal relationship at the club. She expressed that he was incredible, providing her with the craziest lovemaking she had ever experienced. While her revelations caught my attention, I had no initial plans to take any action, considering Patty's divorce status and her freedom to play with whomever she liked. Over the next couple of weeks, my curiosity about Marion grew. I responded more attentively when he flirted with me, such as brushing against me or touching my shoulder while assisting me with the machines. During one workout session, as I performed bench presses in a nearly empty area, he stood behind me as if to spot me. Looking up, I noticed his shorts right above my head, and the sizable bulge of his package caught my attention. I couldn't believe how big and thick it looked in his shorts. He smiled down at me, aware of what I was looking at. I almost dropped the bar on my chest, but managed to finish my reps. As I put the bar back on the rack, he took my hand off the bar and slid it gently down over his shorts. His tool felt as enormous as it looked, and it was hard as a rock. Then, after a couple of minutes, he gently pulled me to my feet, looked around to ensure no one was there, and led me by the hand into his office. I wasn't thinking, kind of dazed. He locked the door behind us, sat me down in a chair, and without a word, pulled off his shorts, standing in front of me. I swear I wasn't thinking at all. We had wild lovemaking. By the time he finished, I was beside myself, exhausted, and totally spent. Shelley reacted with an impressed, "Wow," and it seemed like she genuinely meant it. She assumed that Anne had continued seeing Marion. Anne explained that after the encounter in Marion's office, she had drifted into the shower, feeling dreamy and weak in the knees. Wiped out, she cleaned up and went home, overwhelmed by guilt and fear of being discovered by me. Surprisingly, I didn't suspect anything that night, and it seemed normal. Despite my desire for closeness, she made an excuse, fearing I might notice a change. The following night, she mentioned giving me the full treatment, engaging in closeness until I couldn't continue. Anne admitted staying away from the gym for 2 weeks following the incident. I just knew I couldn't be anywhere near Marion without being tempted again. Finally, I told myself it had been a one-time thing. I was a grown woman with a wonderful husband, and I could resist him. So I started going back. And the first couple of times it was fine. Marion winked at me and flirted a little, but he left me alone. And I thought, this is okay. I'm over this. And I relaxed my guard a little. Then about a week after that, he caught me again at the bench, and the room was empty. And he got my hand on his tool, and in no time, you were back in his office. Shelley finished her sentence, expressing how much better it was. Anne, speaking somewhat dreamily, struggled to describe the experience. She conveyed her deep love for closeness with me, emphasizing our satisfaction in each other. Anne confessed that she had never been tempted to fool around before, even with a flirtatious coworker named Alex. Despite his success with other girls, Anne had remained uninterested. However, with Marion, she felt as though she had never experienced such pleasure before. Giggling, Anne acknowledged the absurdity of sharing such details, emphasizing that there was nothing particularly special about Marion. She clarified that she had no interest in him as a person or a lover. It was solely about the physical aspect. She referred to it as God's gift, prompting laughter from both her and Shelley. I listened to the two of them and felt the anger coursing in my veins. I sat through the rest of the tape, but there wasn't much more. Once he'd had lovemaking with her a second time, he gave up all attempts to resist. She'd been with him 2 to 3 times a week for nearly a month, and there was no sign she was ready to stop. In fact, she said that she'd been enjoying lovemaking with me more lately as well, perhaps because her secret was kind of a turn-on. It was clear that her BTF had overcome whatever guilt she might be feeling about betraying me. Me, the love of her life, her husband of 7 years, the man who was completely devoted to her, and who still remembered what forsaking all others was supposed to mean. It took a while to think through my plans, and it was 02:30 a.m. By the time I went to sleep in the guest room, I was done seeing and sleeping next to her, or even talking to her. I slipped into the bedroom and got clothes for the next day without waking her. At 06:30 a.m., I was up and out the door. I left a brief and cold note, trying not to reveal anything, stating that Anne had an early meeting due to my call. Apologizing for forgetting to mention it, I made 2 copies of the tape last night at the office. By 8:30, I was on the phone with my best friend from college, who worked at a downtown law firm. I requested a favor, asking him to arrange an hour with the meanest and most bloodthirsty divorce lawyer in his firm. There was a moment of silence, and he expressed shock, apologizing for the situation. After a brief conversation, Eddie showed me into the office of Margaret Adamson, a lead partner in his firm, known for her intimidating presence. Eddie had described her as someone even sharks would avoid in the ocean. Margaret's look and handshake confirmed that she meant business, and I was already relieved that she would be representing me rather than Anne. I played Margaret and Eddie part of the tape. After hearing the initial moments, Margaret instructed her assistant to hold her calls, and we listened to the rest. When it concluded, we sat in silence for a minute. Margaret then straightforwardly asked, "Okay, what do you want?" Expressing my desire for a divorce due to infidelity, I emphasized avoiding the cliché of irreconcilable differences. I mentioned being reasonable about our savings, but insisted on keeping the house. Additionally, I wanted Anne to revert to her maiden name, as I believed she no longer deserved to be Mrs. Will Harris. Margaret nodded, studying me intently, and then requested a brief break with Eddie to discuss the legal details. Within 5 minutes, I was back in Margaret's office, and she was ready to proceed. She assured me that the divorce would likely proceed smoothly with Anne accepting the terms. However, she mentioned that the tape would be inadmissible since Anne was unaware of its recording. I grimaced and disclosed the complication involving my sister-in-law Shelley's infidelity, her offer to help, and the content of the first part of the tape. I explained my intention to inform my brother, acknowledging that he would be devastated. Half ironically, I suggested Margaret consider handling my brother's divorce as well. She looked at Eddie and then back at me. We started by listening to Shelley's part of the tape, and after another huddle between Margaret and Eddie, she remarked, "Quite a pair of wives you two picked." Seeing my reaction, she apologized, acknowledging it was inappropriate. Margaret then outlined the situation, stating that the tape might not be admissible against Anne due to her unawareness, but Shelley could be subpoenaed to testify about what Anne told her. It shouldn't make much difference. Once Anne's attorney hears the tape, he won't be in much position to fight. In your brother Dave's case, the tape is admissible because Shelley knew she was being recorded, so she's got no defense whatsoever. That divorce will be easy as long as he's not totally unreasonable. Then there's the health club. We can sue both them and Marion. Marion won't have much money, presumably, but Eddie and I can pretty much guarantee you a nice big check from the club somewhere in the high 6 figures to $1.5 million. The tape could be used in a civil lawsuit, and there's no way in hell they would ever let this get into the newspapers. Think of all the husbands who'd be canceling their wives' club memberships." She laughed briefly, maintaining a somewhat intimidating demeanor. Margaret assured that she would initiate the divorce documents, and Eddie escorted me out of the office. He expressed his apologies, assuring me that Margaret would fulfill my requests. Despite feeling terrible about the situation, I tried to smile and reassured him, saying, "It's okay, Eddie. This just means you and I will have more time to play tennis together." I expressed my gratitude, thanked him, and left. The rest of the day I submerged myself in details. I arranged a locksmith to meet me at the house at 4:30. I made a dinner date with Dave so I wouldn't be around when Anne came home. I cut off her credit cards and arranged separate accounts for our money. And I wrote her a note. It took several tries. Not easy to say goodbye to the love of your life, even under these circumstances. When I finally finished it, I put it in an envelope, wrote Anne's name on the front, and took it home. The locksmith finished by about 5:15. I had a beer, sitting by myself quietly in the kitchen. Then I taped the note to the outside of the front door, locked it, and left. I knew Anne would be home between 6 and 6:30. I idly wondered what she'd do first. Try the door and find her key. Didn't work or read the note. Our marriage is over. Now you'll be free to play around all you want with Marion and his big tool. I've had the locks changed. If you want to get your clothing and personal things, call my attorney. I left Margaret's name and number. She'll arrange for you to have supervised access to the house. When I'm not here, I won't be talking to you again. You broke my heart. I loved you as much as any man can love a woman, and I looked forward to our growing old together. Too bad our marriage vows didn't mean as much to you as some lovemaking with a big tool, or as much as they did to me." When Dave joined me for dinner, he immediately sensed that something was amiss. After placing our orders, I took a deep breath and disclosed that Anne had been cheating on me, and I was planning to divorce her. His reaction was evident, staring at me with an open mouth, a sight I hadn't witnessed before. He expressed shock, exclaiming, "Oh my God, Will! My God, Anne! Are you sure?" Realizing the obvious, he apologized, acknowledging it as a foolish question. He could see the truth in my expression and asked if I wanted to talk about it. I did, sharing my hurt and despair with my best friend over dinner. The beers provided some comfort, but having Dave's unwavering support meant even more. Towards the end of the meal, I revealed another aspect, mentioning that there's one part of it I haven't told him. Shelley is the one who got me proof. She taped a conversation of her and Anne talking, and Anne told her the whole sorry business. Dave looked at me sympathetically, expressing his sorrow. He added that he hoped it wouldn't make me angry, but he felt lucky to have a fantastic wife like Shelley. He mentioned that he's not surprised she helped me, as she has always liked me. He acknowledged that I haven't always approved of her, but began praising her. I couldn't bear to hear more praise for Shelley, especially considering the circumstances. I interrupted him, saying, "Listen, Dave, wait. Don't say anything else. Let me pay the bill, and I need you to come back to the house with me." A note with Will written on it in a flowery handwriting was found under the screen door. Without reading it, I dropped the note on the hall table and ushered him into the guest room. I communicated the seriousness of the situation to Dave, expressing my love for him and emphasizing our friendship. He responded with a wary look, not accustomed to such conversations. I urged him to listen to a tape recorded by Shelley, instructing him to stay seated while I went to another room. Rewinding the tape to the beginning, I pushed the tape recorder toward him and left. In the subsequent moments, I heard quiet murmurs from the tape, followed by a crash. Dave, seemingly agitated, paced around while the tape continued to play until it fell into silence. Upon entering the kitchen, Dave confronted me with intense anger, accusing me of relishing in the knowledge about Shelley and deliberately keeping it from him. He berated me for allowing him to praise her without revealing the truth. He insisted that I must be enjoying the situation, accusing me of harboring a long-standing dislike for Shelley. In response, I stood up and raised my voice, questioning what I had just discovered about him. My glare intensified, and gradually Dave's demeanor softened. His shoulders slumped, fists unclenched, and he sat down at the table, resembling an old man. After a moment, he apologized, saying, "Sorry, Will. I know you're hurting just like I am. It's just you obviously knew about this." "Why didn't you tell me, Dave?" I said as gently as I could. "You know how you were about Shelley. You would never have believed me. Remember that fight we had when I criticized something she'd said to Mom? I found out about Shelley a week ago, and I knew that I couldn't possibly tell you. You had to hear it for yourself. I only got the tape from her yesterday. The two of us emptied a few beer bottles while I told Dave the whole story. I began with seeing Shelley and Robbie at the restaurant, then the deal she offered me, the making of the tape, and my conversation with Margaret Adamson. She's handling my divorce, and she'll be happy to represent you too if you want. Our cases are pretty much a shoo-in," she says. We talked late into the night, and then Dave crashed in my guest room. He didn't have the heart to face Shelley. The phone rang several times, but we didn't answer it. And finally, I just left it off the hook. A few days went by, and then a few weeks, and kept calling for a while, leaving me messages of her crying and begging to talk to me. But I didn't answer or call her back. I just didn't see any reason to talk to her. She tried finding me at work, but I'd asked our receptionist to tip me off, and I ducked out of my office each time she showed up. A couple of times I saw her car parked in front of the house when I came home from work, so I just drove right by and stayed away for a couple of hours until she left. Margaret Adamson did her work beautifully. The divorce papers were served. She fought through all the legal maneuvers that Inn's lawyer tried to pull, and a court date was set. In his initial conversations with Margaret, he claimed that no infidelity had taken place. Once she sent him a copy of the tape, we stopped hearing that line. Instead, he pointed out that the tape was inadmissible. Margaret didn't even dignify that one with a response. She just sat tight. And as the court date approached, Ann's lawyer finally called Margaret to ask for a settlement conference. The day after listening to the tape, Dave moved out of his apartment with Shelley and into my guest room. He drove over and watched the place until she went out, then called me. The two of us packed up everything he wanted and got out of there in less than 2 hours. He told me, "I don't want to see her. I don't want to hear a word she has to say. I just want to get the hell away from her." His eyes started to tear up, and I turned away. Was it a good thing or a bad thing that I knew just how he felt? Shelley left me a couple of angry, cursing messages at home, a nice counterpoint to Ann's remorseful ones. After a day or two, I started screening the messages, deleting any from Shelley and as soon as I heard their voices, Shelley called Dave at work and sent him letters. But he never responded to them. Margaret was handling his divorce too, and he and I just sat back and let her run the show. To my amazement, the lawsuits against Marion and the health club were resolved first. The one against Marion never went anywhere. He disappeared one day and left no forwarding address. But the health club, eager to avoid negative publicity, just as Margaret had predicted, reached a $1.1 million settlement. I signed a pledge of confidentiality and walked away with the largest check I'd ever seen in less than 10 weeks. My brother was a rock, and I guess I was for him too. We lived like two bachelors, going out to eat a lot, taking in a ball game from time to time, or just sitting around and talking over a few beers. We talked about, and then Shelley, about our lives with them, about how many great women there were out there just waiting for us. It wasn't easy to believe that last bit, and yet we were really able to help each other. I could see as plain as day that there wasn't a thing wrong with Dave that led to Shelley's behavior. She was simply a selfish strumpet. Likewise, Dave reassured me that Inch cheating wasn't a reflection on me, just an indication of how screwed up SG was. Neither of us probably believed the other one all that much, but it still helped to hear it. Dave was divorced first, as it turned out. He made it clear that he wouldn't talk to Shelley under any circumstances. And so Margaret handled the whole thing. She told him that Shelley had fought for more money at first, but that with the tape, she didn't have a leg to stand on. I went into the office with him the day he had to sign the papers. Shelley had already signed them. He smiled grimly, shook Margaret's hand, and thanked her, and then went off to the men's room. I heard him crying through the door. When I went to find him 3 weeks later, it was my turn. We met on a Tuesday, and in me and the two lawyers, and in her lawyer had agreed to a settlement but insisted on two conditions: that I drop infidelity as a reason for the divorce, and that I meet privately with, and before we signed the papers. I told Margaret I was willing to see, but not willing to drop infidelity. Eventually, we agreed that I'd give Anne a chance to persuade me. If she could do so, we'd change it to irreconcilable differences, that old standby. In a weird way, I was looking forward to hearing what Anne had to say. Maybe I'm a masochist, but I loved her for 10 years, and I couldn't really imagine simply walking away without one final conversation. When I got there and was sitting in the conference room wearing a blue dress she knew I'd always loved. Her hair was shorter, and it looked great. She was pale, but she was the same beautiful woman I had loved for so long. "Okay, it's your meeting," I said neutrally. My heart was pounding, but I tried to look calm. "Just 2 things. All right? Please don't tell me how much you love me, and don't tell me it was just love-making." She flushed, and I could see tears welling up in her eyes. "Will, I'm so sorry, but how can I not say those things? I screwed up, plain and simple. I was selfish and thoughtless, and I hurt you. But it was just love-making, nothing but a stupid, stupid impulse. I gave in to you. Can't imagine how much I've gone over it, how many times I wished I had never done it. Yes, well, but you did do it, didn't you? I had no intention of making this easy for her. Just being in the same room with her, knowing that we were about to separate for good, and why broke my heart all over again." I went to the window and gazed out, unwilling to let her see my stricken face. Behind me, I could hear her crying softly. "Baby, it was. It didn't mean anything, you know. It was the dumbest, most hurtful thing I could ever have done to you. I know that, but it meant nothing to me. It has nothing to do with how much I love you." I let her talk a bit more, listening to the pleading tone, the sweet voice I had always loved, but not hearing a single word that I couldn't have predicted. She had nothing to say to me that I didn't already know, and nothing that made a damn bit of difference. After a while, I turned around and came back to the table, sitting down directly across from her. "And just so you know, I still love you very much. But it's over between us." She started to cry again. "You took from me, from us, the most precious thing we had together, aside from our love, the bond of trust between us. How could I ever make love to you again? Wondering if it was me you were thinking about or Marion and his freak show tool. How would I know whether you were loving me or missing him? And how could I live with you, wondering where you were every time you were 10 minutes late coming home, wondering what you were doing on your lunch hour, wondering whether you'd found another big tool to play around with?" I waited, but she had no reply to make. Finally, between the sobs, she said, "Please, baby, please. Couldn't you give me one more chance? And I'll give you a few minutes to think about this one. What if I had met some bimbo with fantastic big jugs and started bawling her on the side for a few weeks, nobody I liked or respected? Just a handsome girl who was a fantastic lay, who gave me a degree of pure physical pleasure that I never got from you. And then you found out about it. Could you stay with me? Could you get past the feelings of hurt? The sense of total betrayal? Could you overcome the doubts you'd have about your own attractiveness? The fears that you weren't ever going to be the one I really wanted?" She looked up at me with the saddest eyes I had ever seen. "Well, I don't have to think about it. I've thought about it for weeks now. Could I forgive you? Could I take you back if it were the other way around? And the answer is no, I couldn't. I just couldn't handle those feelings. I know that. So I'm asking you to do something I couldn't do, to be a braver, stronger person than I could ever be, and to give me a chance to make it up to you a lifetime, to show you how sorry I am and how much I love you." There was silence a minute, 2 minutes, as we looked at one another, both of us thinking about all we had meant to one another and how we had arrived. At this point, I stood up slowly, hating myself and hating her for cheating on me, and now for throwing it all back on me. I don't know whether I can't do it or won't do it, but I'm not that braver, stronger person you want me to be. Goodbye. And I waited by the open door for a moment, looking back, giving her a chance for the last word. She had her head down, crying. She didn't say anything else. Margaret was waiting for me down the hall, a surprisingly sympathetic look on her hard face. "Let her have irreconcilable differences," I growled. "It doesn't make a damn bit of difference to me." Dave and I sat at my kitchen table. We'd had a few, but we weren't drunk. "Listen," I said, I've made some plans." He nodded, and I went on. "After the lawyer's fees, I still have nearly $800,000 from that settlement. I've invested all but $50,000 of it in some nice, safe places, so there will be a lovely nest egg for when we're old and feeble. But the last 50 grand has been designated to Will and Dave Harris Recovery Fund, and we're going to start spending some of it. I've rented us 4 weeks at a 2-bedroom condo in Cancun, starting 2 weeks from now. Go tell your office you're taking some time off. We are going to be a pair of fun-loving bachelors, 2 gay divorces, if you know what I mean." He just raised an eyebrow, and I laughed. No a-hole. Gay, as in cheerful. We've done enough moping around telling each other how badly we've been screwed over. Cancun was a blast, or at least as much of one as it can be for 2 guys recovering from broken hearts. We got a lot of sun, played a lot of tennis, swam a lot, and drank a lot, though we kept one another from going off the deep end with each passing day. We got tanner, a little fitter, and slightly further from the nightmare we just lived through. And let me say, God bless my charismatic and charming brother. Despite the blow to his self-confidence that Shelley had laid on him, he got his old groove back, and we had a lot of female companionship. His favorite stunt, and damned if it didn't succeed 75% of the time, was to spot 2 attractive women sitting together. He'd drag me straight over to their table, smile winningly, and say, "Pardon me, ladies. I'm sure you wouldn't be comfortable letting a stranger buy you a drink, so let me introduce my brother, Will Harris." Then it was up to me, the shyer one, to say, "Delighted to meet you both. This is my brother, Dave Harris." Then he would step back in. "Phew, glad that's taken care of. Now, may we buy you a drink?" By this time, the women were usually at least grinning, if not laughing, and we'd mostly find ourselves with female companionship for the evening. Sometimes the companionship lasted until breakfast. After all, unattached women in Cancun were as eager for fun as we were. I had maybe 6 different women in my bed over those 4 weeks, and I imagine Dave's number was a little higher. Mostly it was fun, just laughter and pleasure, and keeping it light. The first couple of times I made love to a woman, I was tentative, distracted by thoughts of Marion and his huge tool, even though both he and were thousands of miles away. It was hard to compete with what I knew he had done to her. But the women didn't seem to notice, and being with someone new got easier each time. One-night stands may not be for everyone or for every stage in a person's life, but they seemed to be what Dave and I needed. Only one of the women was different, Shannon, a tall Irish redhead a year younger than I was. We did all the same things, had some drinks, laughed a lot, went for dinner, did some dancing, and back to my place to bed. She was handsome and responsive, as eager to be with me as I was to be with her. We had a lot of fun. When it got different was later, around 3 a.m. For some reason, I woke up and just lay in bed, Shannon softly breathing in sleep beside me. Thoughts of and filled my head, and all that we had had together and how it had been taken from me. I started crying very quietly, and before I knew it, Shannon was kneeling beside me, holding me in her arms, saying, "Let it out, baby, it's okay." I was embarrassed, but I couldn't stop. She kept soothing me, and finally, in response to her urgings, I told her the whole story. By the time I was done, the sun was rising. We shuffled into the kitchen, and I made breakfast for us while she told me her own story. Also a divorce, no cheating, just a husband who grew ever more distant, ever more driven and career-oriented, until there was just no marriage left. She'd been on her own for nearly 2 years. After eating, we found our way back to the bedroom without a word spoken and made love. The night before had been screwing, fun, exciting, friendly, but just lovemaking. This time, we looked into each other's eyes, murmured tenderly, and found a very different level of closeness. My one-night stand with Shannon turned into 4 wonderful nights. In the afternoon, she left. My brother Dave was a little worried about me, I think. Urging me to meet new ladies, he mentioned it was time to move on. I acknowledged that one was special. He agreed, saying he liked her too. However, he reminded me that she had gone home, and we still had 10 more days to spend down here. He dragged me off to the tennis court, then the pool, and by that evening, we were chatting with 2 secretaries from San Francisco on their very first trip outside the United States. That night, they slept in their own hotel room, but the next afternoon, Barbara joined me in my room for her first ever experience on foreign soil. Dave and I went out for dinner at a steak place we both liked. It had been 8 months since Cancun. Dave had long since found a terrific apartment he liked, but we still spent a lot of time together. Just after we ordered, Dave leaned forward and mentioned quietly that across the room, 2 couples had just sat down, and one of them was her, with some guy. I appreciated the warning, and despite my sudden thumping heart, I waited a few seconds before casually turning around to look across the dance floor. She had already spotted us and was looking steadily over at me. I gave her a friendly, non-committal smile and a wave, and she smiled back. Then, I forced myself to turn around and chat some more with my brother. He inquired if this was the first time I had seen her since the divorce, and I nodded. I admitted that I didn't think I'd have this much of a reaction, but the surprise had something to do with it. I suggested to Dave that he do me a favor. Let's enjoy our dinner and not tell me anything about what she's doing over there, how she looks. I didn't want to know. Dave agreed, saying that it's fine, and then he launched into a funny story about a coworker who had been flirting with him for a couple of weeks. While he wasn't terribly interested in her, he was enjoying the game. While enjoying our coffees and casually observing the dancing couples, I felt a hand on my shoulder and heard that familiar voice inquiring about my well-being. Rising from my seat, I gazed into Anne's eyes and offered a greeting, once again caught off guard. She suggested a dance for old time's sake, and I agreed willingly. As we danced, memories flooded back. Her warmth in my arms, her beauty, and the nostalgia for happier times. Amidst discussing mundane topics like our jobs and the weather, we eventually lapsed into silence. Lost in the emotions of holding her again, I reflected on the dances we shared and the realization that those moments were now memories. Towards the end of the dance, Anne pulled back to look into my eyes and inquired about my well-being. Despite not owing her any honesty, I decided to share my feelings. I expressed that I was all right, pretty good, I guessed. Some days were better than others. Seeing her that night, dancing together, was powerful, and I didn't know I would feel this much. Anne, with a serious expression, confessed that she wasn't so all right. She missed me every day, and being in my arms again had a profound effect on her. Unsure of how to respond, I remained silent as the music played its last chords. Anne hesitated to let me go and shared a thought. Had I ever wondered if I made the right decision? She admitted that she still thought about us all the time, but usually didn't get much past wondering why I made the wrong decision. Later, when I dropped Dave off, he expressed concern about my well-being. I reassured him, acknowledging the inevitability of such encounters in a small town. Confirming our tennis plans for the next day, I headed home. In the dim bedroom, as I undressed quietly, she rolled over towards me and inquired about my evening with Dave. I shared the strangeness of the encounter, contemplating that it might have been for the best that she hadn't joined. She responded with a loving smile, proposing that I hold her for a few minutes. Embracing, I felt her tender kisses along the side of my neck, savoring her familiar scent.